The flywheel kicked backward, tearing the crank handle from his grip as the engine groaned like a dying animal. A burst of steam blew the cylinder head off, clanging against the shed wall as something dark and hot splattered across his chest. He froze, staring at the fingerprints still pressed into the white-hot bearing race, a print that wasn't his, and hadn't cooled in 64 years. The engine was a 1917 Blackstone oil engine. Hit and miss, one lunger, about 5 horsepower. It had been sitting in the back of a shed on a property near Castlereagh since 1962. The woman who owned the property, her name was Margaret, she'd inherited it from her uncle who died in '89. She didn't know what it was. She just knew it was heavy and in the way and she wanted it gone. A young bloke named Oliver found it through a Facebook marketplace listing that said, "Old motor, $50, you move it." He was 23, worked at a printing shop in Merrickville, and had no business taking on something like that. But he'd grown up watching his grandfather restore old tractors out near Mudgee, and something about the listing caught him. Here's what he didn't know. The engine had been bought new in 1917 by a dairy farmer named John Hennessy, who used it to run a cream separator and a water pump. It ran every day for 43 years. In 1960, the main bearing seized. Hennessy's son, a mechanic by trade, took it apart, made a new bearing by hand in a lathe he'd built himself from scrap, and put it back together. It ran for another 2 years, then something else gave out, and by then the farm was being subdivided and nobody had time for it. That part Oliver learned later. What he knew on the day he drove out to Castlereagh was that he was buying a seized engine that had been sitting under a tarp for 60 years. Margaret helped him load it into his trailer. She was in her late 70s, sharp-eyed, wearing a gardening hat that had seen better days. She watched him tie it down and said, "My uncle used to say that engine would outlast him." Reckon he was right. Oliver laughed, not because it was funny. Because the alternative was worse. He'd just spent his entire week's pay on fuel and trailer hire for something he wasn't sure he could move, let alone fix. He got it back to the garage he rented behind a panel beater's shop in St. Peter's. It was a narrow space, concrete floor, a single fluorescent tube that flickered for 10 minutes before it warmed up. The kind of place where you learn to work by feel because the light is never quite right. The engine sat on a pallet for 3 months while Oliver figured out what he had. He'd never worked on a hit and miss before. He knew the theory. The governor holds the exhaust valve open until the engine slows down, then lets it close so it fires again. But knowing and understanding are two different things, and understanding and fixing are two more. The flywheels were rusted solid. The piston was seized in the cylinder. The head was cracked, someone had tried to weld it with a stick welder and made a mess. The magneto was missing entirely. Half the studs were snapped off flush with the block. Most people would have scrapped it. Oliver almost did. He told George he sat on an upturned bucket looking at it for an hour one night, and he kept coming back to the same thought, somebody made this. Somebody designed every part, cast it, machined it, assembled it. Somebody knew what each piece was supposed to do. And now that knowledge was gone, and the engine was just a lump of rusted iron waiting to be melted down. That's the moment the anomaly becomes undeniable, even if you don't have words for it yet. You're looking at something that was built to last longer than the person who built it. And it did. But now there's nobody left who remembers what it sounded like when it ran. The real mistake here is thinking restoration is about the machine. It's not. It never is. The machine is just the excuse. What you're really doing is trying to bridge a gap between someone who knew something and someone who wants to know it. The engine is just the language they used. Oliver started with the easy stuff. He soaked the piston in penetrating oil for 2 weeks, heating the cylinder with a propane torch every evening after work, letting it cool, heating it again. On the 14th night, he tapped the piston with a brass drift and it moved about a millimeter. He said he nearly cried. It took another 3 weeks to work the piston free. Each night, a little more movement. Each night, he'd clean the rust off the exposed part of the piston, oil it, work it back and forth. He started keeping a log, not because he planned to document the restoration, but because he needed to prove to himself that progress was happening. Some nights he'd measure the movement in fractions of an inch and write them down anyway. The cylinder bore was badly pitted. He measured it with a bore gauge he'd borrowed from an old mechanic named Jack who worked at an engine reconditioning place in Tempe. Jack took one look at the block and said, "You know they don't make pistons for these anymore, right?" Oliver knew. Nobody's made a piston for a Blackstone since the war. Which war? Take your pick. Oliver asked if it could be sleeved. Jack said it could, but the sleeve would have to be custom-made, and the cost would be more than the engine was worth. Then he paused and said, "But that ain't really the point, is it?" It wasn't a question. Jack had been a mechanic for 52 years. He'd started as an apprentice in 1972 at a garage in Newtown that still had a sign out front saying, "Horse shoring." He'd seen every kind of engine come and go. What he hadn't seen was young blokes wanting to fix them. "You're the first person under 40 who's asked me about a bore gauge in 5 years, he said. That counts for something. Jack's words hung in the air, but what he didn't tell Oliver was that the Blackstone seized bearing had a secret that would take more than a bore gauge to uncover. He offered to help. Said he had a lathe at home, a 1948 Hercus he'd bought off a retired toolmaker in 1985. He'd never made a piston from scratch before, but he'd made plenty of other things. How hard can it be? The answer, it turned out, was very hard. But they figured it out. Jack had the casting pattern for the piston made by a pattern maker in Leichhardt who still did that kind of work. The pattern maker was 83 years old and only took cash. He charged them $200 and said, "This is the last pattern I'll ever make. My hands don't work like they used to." Oliver paid him and didn't ask what that meant. What strikes me at this point is how many people this engine pulled in. The pattern maker. Jack. An old fitter named Bill who'd worked on Blackstones in the 1950s on a sheep station out past Burke. Bill heard about the project through a mutual friend and called Oliver one night. He said, "I've got the manual. The original. You want it?" Oliver drove 3 hours to a town called Goolgong to pick it up. Bill was 91, living in a unit behind his daughter's house. He had the manual in a plastic sleeve. It was from 1917, creased and stained, with handwritten notes in the margins in pencil. Bill had written things like, "This bolt is 5/16 Whitworth, not 5/16 BSF, and, the head gasket can be made from gasket paper soaked in linseed oil overnight." Oliver asked him if he'd ever seen one run. Bill was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I saw one run in 1954. It was pumping water at a bore on a property near Coburg. I was 17. I remember the sound because it was the only thing for 100 miles that wasn't wind or flies. It just went chuff, pause, chuff, pause. Like it was breathing. I never forgot it." He paused. "That engine you've got. It was one of the first ones they made after they moved to the new factory. Have you ever bought something old and forgotten, only to find out later it had a history that made it worth far more than you paid? I can tell by the casting numbers. You find the magneto yet?" Oliver said no. Bill said, "I might know where one is. But you'll have to come back tomorrow. I need to think about where I put it." Oliver came back the next day. Bill had found the magneto in a box under his house. It was a 1917 Bosch, the correct one for that engine. Bill had been keeping it for 68 years, waiting for someone who needed it. He gave it to Oliver for free. "Just send me a video when it runs." That's the thing about this kind of restoration. You're not just fixing a machine. You're collecting the last fragments of a knowledge that's disappearing. Every old bloke you meet has one piece of the puzzle. The pattern maker had the skill to make the pattern. Jack had the lathe. Bill had the magneto and the manual. The only way any of it worked was if someone young enough to lift the heavy parts and stubborn enough to see it through brought them all together. Oliver spent 18 months on that engine. He documented everything, every measurement, every failed attempt, every breakthrough. He set up a camera on a tripod and filmed the first time it fired. That took 9 months. It ran for 3 seconds and stopped. The next time, it ran for about a minute. He adjusted the governor, recut the valve seats, made a new pushrod because the old one was bent. The first time it ran properly, he said it sounded exactly like Bill described. Chuff, pause, chuff, pause. The flywheel spinning, the hit and miss mechanism doing its work. He filmed it and sent the video to Bill. Bill's daughter called him the next day to say her father had watched it 10 times and cried each time. Oliver didn't tell anyone that he'd cried too. He entered the engine in a show at the Australasian Museum of Rural Machinery in Goulburn. It was the first time it had operated in public since 1962. People gathered around it. Old farmers stood and listened. One of them, a man in his 80s, said, "That's a Blackstone. I haven't heard one of those since I was a kid." The engine won a small award that year. Oliver doesn't mention the award when he talks about it. He talks about the old man who stood there for an hour, just listening. Margaret, the woman who sold him the engine, died in 2023. Oliver heard about it from a neighbor. He didn't go to the funeral. He didn't know her well enough. But he thought about her uncle, the one who said the engine would outlast him. It did. By quite a bit. Here's the part that sticks with me. Oliver told George that the most important thing he learned wasn't about engines. It was about what happens when you dedicate yourself to something that most people would call pointless. He said he spent the first year defending the project to everyone, his parents, his co-workers, his friends. Why are you wasting your time on that? You could buy a modern generator for less. What are you going to do with it when it's done? He didn't have an answer at first. But by the end, he did. He said, "I'm not going to do anything with it. I'm just going to keep it running. That's the point. It runs. It shouldn't, but it does. And as long as it runs, that day in 1960 when the son made that bearing by hand, that day still matters." I think about that a lot. When the truth costs more than the lie that replaced it, what does keeping it change? Oliver's answer, I think, is that it changes nothing and everything. Nothing about the world got easier. No corporation changed its practices. No economic system was overturned. But one 1917 Blackstone oil engine runs again, and there's a video of it that Bill watched until he died, and there's a young bloke in St. Peter's who knows how to make a piston from scratch. So here's what Oliver found out when he finally asked Margaret why the engine's serial number had been ground off, and why she'd lied about her uncle owning it. That's not nothing. Oliver still has the engine. It sits in his garage on a wheeled stand he built from steel tubing. He starts it once a month, lets it warm up, adjusts the timing if it needs it. He's learned to read the sound the way Bill described, listening for the pause, the breath between hits. If the pause is too long, something's off. If it's too short, the governor needs adjusting. The engine tells you what it needs if you know how to listen. Some things, you can learn from a manual. Some things, you can only learn from a 91-year-old man in Goulgong who kept a magneto for 68 years because he believed someone would need it someday. What I don't know is whether Oliver ever figured out why that bearing failed in 1960. He told George he inspected the original bearing and it looked fine, better than the one he made, actually. The son's work was precise. Good enough that Oliver couldn't improve on it. So why did the engine seize? Oliver's theory is that it wasn't the bearing. Do you think Oliver is right to question the bearing, or is he overthinking a 60-year-old engine that simply wore out? It was the fuel line. He found a hairline crack in the fuel line that would have let air in, leaning out the mixture, causing the engine to run hot. The son probably replaced the bearing thinking that was the problem, put it back together, and the crack got worse over 2 years until the engine wouldn't run at all. By then, the farm was being sold, and nobody cared why it stopped. They just knew it did. That crack, the real cause, was invisible. It was a hairline. You'd never find it unless you knew to look. And nobody looked. This is exactly where everything changes. Oliver could have stopped. He had the engine running. He had the award. He had the video. But he kept going, kept digging, kept asking why. And what he found was that the problem had never been the part everyone blamed. It was the thing nobody saw. The thing that looked fine. The thing you'd never think to check. I asked George what Oliver did with that knowledge. He said Oliver fixed the crack, adjusted the timing, and the engine ran better than it ever had. Then he wrote a note and taped it to the fuel line. It said, "Check this first." Metal remembers, I guess. But only if you ask the right questions. The engine is still running. Oliver starts it on the first Sunday of every month, films it, puts the video online. He has a small following now, people who watch because it reminds them of something. A sound they half remember. A rhythm they recognize without knowing why. Last year, a man from Queensland drove down with his grandson to see it. The man was 86. He'd worked on a Blackstone when he was a boy on a farm near Roma. He said, "That engine you've got, it's a 1917, isn't it? I can tell by the governor arm. They changed the design in 1919. This one's got the old style." Oliver offered to let him start it. The man's hands shook as he adjusted the fuel and spun the flywheel. The engine caught on the second compression, settled into its rhythm. Chuff, pause, chuff, pause. The man stood there, his hand resting on the flywheel guard, feeling the vibration through his palm. He didn't say anything. Neither did his grandson. After a while, the man turned to Oliver and said, "We had one of these. My father sold it in 1968. I never thought I'd hear one again." He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Oliver keeps a log of every start, every adjustment, every visit from someone who remembers. He's got a notebook full of names and dates and stories. The notebook is almost full. He bought a new one. That's what I mean about documentation. It's not about preserving the engine. It's about preserving the moment when someone who thought they'd lost something gets it back, even if it's just for a few minutes, even if it's just a sound. If you want to know what it looks like, there are videos. Oliver posts them under the name, Blackstone_1917. The first one is shaky, poorly lit, filmed on his phone propped against a can of penetrating oil. The most recent one is shot with a proper camera, well lit, edited. You can see the flywheel spinning, the governor doing its work, the exhaust puffing. But the sound is the same in all of them. Chuff, pause, chuff, pause. Like it's breathing. What I keep coming back to is Bill. 91 years old, living behind his daughter's house in Goolgong, keeping a magneto for 68 years. He didn't know Oliver existed. He didn't know the engine existed. He just kept it because he believed that someday, someone would need it. How do you live like that? How do you hold on to something for nearly 7 decades, not knowing if it will ever matter, just because you believe it might? That's the part one can't answer. I don't think Oliver can either. But he's trying. Every time he starts that engine, he's proving Bill right. The engine is still in St. Peter's. Oliver has a new project now, an old lister that someone gave him. But he still starts the Blackstone once a month. He says he doesn't do it for himself anymore. He does it for the people who might hear it and remember. That old man Bill keeping the magneto for 68 years, would you have held on to it that long? If this story made you believe in quiet, stubborn hope, that's exactly what the like button is for. If you've ever kept something for years with no proof it'd ever matter, this channel is where you belong.